once you have your vision, just go for it. And now that we're in section 3, we're going to be talking about the details of how you carry out your vision and make it happen and move forward. So this is like a really exciting part of the course because we're going to get into specific details. But first today, I want to give you a really important lesson that I learned from somebody who lived more than 2,000 years ago. So when Rome was just a republic, it wasn't this huge empire that you've heard of later with all these legions and soldiers. When it was just a tiny little, essentially small city with a few outposts outlying here and there, but enemies within a few days' march, they had a consul named Appius Claudius. Excuse me, he wasn't a consul, he was actually the censor. And his job was to be in charge of the treasury and to pay for and figure out how to finance public works projects. Sounds like a boring bureaucratic job, but Appius Claudius turned it into something epic. Um, he had this vision about building a road, and this wasn't going to be like any road that anyone had ever seen before. At the time, remember, this was way before most of the things you associate with Rome. Roads were just these dirt tracks that went through, from one town to another. They were, often just muddy and impassable during the winter and dusty and dry during the summer. Sometimes you'd have to throw some logs down to keep your cart wheels or your wagon wheels from getting caught in the mud. They weren't really a major structural thing, but Appius Claudius had this great idea. He said, we're going to make a road that's passable in any kind of weather. And so he started out by paving the road from Rome to Capua with gravel. And now this was no simple task. Remember, the gravel had to be quarried from somewhere. It had to be broken up into tiny pieces. Those had to be loaded onto a cart by hand, hauled to the work site just using horses and mules and other animals. And then they had to be unloaded by hand onto the roadbed. And people had to, again, with manual labor, just spread the gravel out so it was even and it covered all the surfaces. And this was done, again, with hand tools, with manual labor, and it was just an arduous, long-lasting task. It was super expensive. And already this was something that had never really been attempted before at this scale. But that was just the beginning. Next, they dug trenches on the sides of the road so that any water that got in would just drain away. And there are still canals on the sides of the Via Appia to this day that are remnants of what was once there. And then they covered the gravel with something more solid and durable. They actually paved the Appian Way with stones of basalt. Now, basalt is a volcanic rock that's so strong and durable that a lot of these stones look the same today as they did thousands of years ago when they were first laid down. And they cut these into these perfect shapes that would fit together like puzzle pieces. And all of this was done by hand, which must have been a challenge because this rock is so tough. They probably broke a lot of tools as they cut the basalt down into the shapes they wanted. They had to load it onto carts, bring it to the work site, unload it by hand, lay it all out. It took a long time, a lot of work. And then they had to do it again. They put a second layer of basalt above the first layer in many places, a layer that was just rectangles of basalt that were placed perpendicular to the direction of the road so that there'd be some traction for wheels to catch. Now, this was a really challenging task. It almost bankrupted the entire Roman Republic. It almost emptied out their treasury. And this road wasn't very practical at the time because it didn't go like from Rome to a port town or lead to a famous temple or lead to another city. It actually just went down to nowhere. It went south and east into towards the parts of Italy that were then controlled by some of the Romans' worst enemies. And so a lot of people didn't like this project that was being done. People shook their heads, but it turned out to be a great idea because once it was in place, it was easy for the Romans, of course, to move soldiers, messengers, merchants, supplies from one place to another. They were able to build more outposts and monitor them more easily. And this model eventually enabled them to control the entire Italian peninsula. And later they copied it and built roads when they conquered other places around the entire Mediterranean. And many of these roads are still there today. So why am I telling you all this? Because there's an important lesson here. Don't carry out your quest and your adventure on a dirt road. Take the time to focus on the details that are going to make you successful. Play this to win as you make your plan. Don't be afraid to do a little extra work, to spend a little extra money, to make the effort it's going to take to really have this shine and go forth. So, as you move on to basically mapping out your adventure, which is what we're going to do now. Keep this in mind and just keep on going and build your Appian way that's going to lead you to success.